So as mentioned in the introductory lecture, the part of the brain that controls the endocrine system is the hypothalamus. And so this is a cartoon view of the base of the brain where the hypothalamus is located. Now, hanging from the hypothalamus by way of this little stalk, if you will, also known as the infundibulum or the pituitary stalk, is the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland is often called the master endocrine gland. It is directly connected to, anatomically, the hypothalamus, so it gets direct information and instructions from the brain. And it also releases a whole bunch of hormones that are capable of having an influence on the other glands of the endocrine system. So, there are two regions of the pituitary gland. The anterior region of the pituitary gland is like any other gland. It has different kinds of cells that make and release hormones into what's called the systemic circulation, meaning the circulation that will go all over the body and make contact with every cell in the body. Now, what triggers the release of hormones from the cells in the anterior part of the pituitary gland is that there are neurons in the hypothalamus that make and releasing hormones, which are also known as tropic hormones, because they're going to ultimately travel down here and stimulate the cells in the anterior pituitary to release other hormones. Now, there's this special little kind of closed blood vessel loop, circulatory loop, that is between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So neurons in the hypothalamus will releasing hormones into this little what's called the closed portal circulation, and it's called that because it's basically a portal that goes nowhere except the anterior pituitary. These hormones that are releasing hormones from neurons in the hypothalamus, they can only travel to the anterior pituitary. They do not travel out in the systemic circulation. And so when the releasing hormones arrive at the anterior pituitary, they diffuse out. And when they bump into a cell that has a receptor for them, they will bind the receptor on that cell, causing that cell to release additional hormones, some of which are tropic hormones themselves, into the systemic circulation. So this is the anterior part of the pituitary gland. The posterior part of the pituitary gland is very different. There are actually no cells there, so it's not the same kind of tissue as any other endocrine gland, and it's a different kind of tissue than the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is made of neural tissue, so it's the same as the brain. And it only contains axons of neurons that live in the hypothalamus. So you can see that there are these neuron cell bodies up here, and what happens is these neurons in their cell bodies, they make hormones. They send the hormones down the axons, which travel along the pituitary stalk, down into the posterior pituitary, and there the axons of these neurons will release hormones into the systemic circulation. So it's a very different process between the anterior and posterior pituitary. The hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary are made by neurons that live in the hypothalamus and go directly into the systemic circulation. So it's very different than what we talked about for the anterior pituitary. So let's talk, this is just another view of the hypothalamus and the anterior and posterior pituitary, and I want to talk a little bit about the two hormones that get made and released from the posterior pituitary. So remember, these hormones are made up in the hypothalamus and they are released into the systemic circulation by axons that travel to the posterior pituitary. One of these is called oxytocin. It is involved in a number of reproductive functions. So the uterine contractions that are produced during labor and delivery are stimulated by oxytocin. For a mother with a newborn, in order for milk to be released from the mammary glands, you need oxytocin to bind receptors in the mammary glands. Oxytocin has also been implicated in orgasm in both males and females, and in a number of actual behaviors that are related to reproduction, such as parental behaviors and social bonding behaviors. So in other words, oxytocin levels will increase in both parents of newborn children, whether they're biological children or adopted children, and that helps to facilitate various parental behaviors that provide survival, enhance survival of the offspring, as well as social bonding behavior that kind of connects all of the family members together. And there are many other functions of oxytocin that are under investigation currently related to kind of social behaviors. The other hormone that is made in the hypothalamus and released from the posterior pituitary is a hormone called vasopressin, or more descriptively, it's known as antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, because it acts opposite to a diuretic. So a diuretic would be a medication you would take that would increase urination. Antidiuretic hormone acts on the kidney to decrease urination, and it is an important hormone that gets released, for example, if you're dehydrated, as part of the response to counter that dehydration. ADH gets released, it acts on the kidney to tell the kidney stop releasing so much water into the urine, keep it in the body, and that will counter dehydration. In rodents, this hormone has also been shown to be involved in social behavior, but there's not evidence for that in humans. So as far as we know, vasopressin, or ADH, has mainly to do with maintaining homeostasis, a stable state of body fluid composition. So those are the two hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary. Now, the anterior pituitary releases 6 different hormones. 4 of those hormones are actually tropic hormones themselves. So remember, the way that these hormones get released from the anterior pituitary is there are neurons in the hypothalamus. They release releasing hormones into the portal circulation. The releasing hormones will diffuse out at the anterior pituitary, bind cells here, triggering the release of other hormones into the systemic circulation. 4 of the hormones that get released are actually tropic hormones that will go and act on other endocrine glands. And these include thyroid stimulating hormone, which will then stimulate the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. A hormone called ACTH, which acts on the adrenal gland to stimulate the release of hormones involved in the stress response. And then 2 hormones that together are known as the gonadotropins, because they are tropic hormones that will bind receptors on the gonads, which are ovaries and testes, and play a role in reproduction, both behavior and physiology. And these gonadotropins are known as luteinizing hormone, LH, and follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. So you can see that these 4 tropic hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary, their only job is to circulate to their target glands and trigger the release of hormones from those other target glands. So that's why they're called tropic hormones. Now, there are also 2 hormones released from the anterior pituitary that are not tropic hormones. One of these is growth hormone, which is just released directly into the circulation to act on muscle and bone to promote skeletal muscle and bone growth. The other is prolactin, which circulates and binds receptors on the mammary glands to promote milk production. And so obviously it's only going to be released in mothers who have, in women who have recently had babies. So this is sort of the pattern. Now remember, all 6 of these hormones have their own individual releasing hormone that triggers their release from the anterior pituitary, and that those releasing hormones come from the hypothalamus. So if we look at kind of a scheme of how this works, remember we have the hypothalamus releasing a releasing hormone which will bind cells in the anterior pituitary to produce another hormone which will then stimulate an endocrine organ to release another hormone which ultimately produces the physiological effect you want. So here's a little table to kind of show you how this is all related. So for example, let's talk about, these are referred to as tropic hormone axes. So this column shows you the releasing hormone that's released by the hypothalamus, and then what tropic hormone it triggers the release of from the pituitary, coded in blue here, and then what endocrine organ is targeted by that tropic hormone from the anterior pituitary, and then what hormone is released from that target organ to actually have an effect on the body. So this first row shows you the what's known as the HPT axis. H for hypothalamus, P for pituitary, T for thyroid gland. So the hormone that's released from the hypothalamus is called thyroid releasing hormone. It triggers the release from cells in the anterior pituitary of another hormone, tropic hormone, called thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone travels to the thyroid gland to trigger the release of thyroid hormone, which will act to increase the metabolism of cells. Similarly, we have what's known as the HPA axis, which we'll talk about when we talk about stress in a future unit. And what this axis does is the releasing hormone is a hormone called corticotropin releasing hormone. It triggers the release of a tropic hormone called ACTH from the anterior pituitary, which will travel to the adrenal gland and trigger the release of hormones called glucocorticoids, which will act on cells to produce the response that is needed during stress, which is to mobilize energy. Now in this unit, we focus on what's known as the HPG axis, the hypothalamo-pituitary gonadal axis, and that involves the gonadotropins that we talked about that get released from the anterior pituitary. So what triggers their release is a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus called gonadotropin releasing hormone. It couldn't be more descriptive. It triggers the release of the gonadotropins from the pituitary. The gonadotropins are FSH and LH. They circulate to the gonads, the testes and ovaries, and trigger the release of other hormones like estrogens, progesterone, testosterone. Testosterone, I should mention, is one of a family of hormones called androgens. Testosterone, main one in humans. And so these are all steroid hormones. I should mention glucocorticoids are also steroid hormones as well. So all of the future lectures that we cover in this chapter will have to do with this HPG axis, and so you should be sure to know what exactly is the process by which these gonadal hormones, as we call them, estrogens, progesterone, and androgens, you should know the mechanism by which they're released through this system. And then of course once you get enough estrogen, it's going to, or testosterone as the case may be, it's going to feed back onto both the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary to produce negative feedback to inhibit the production of more of that hormone.